Hello everyone. We're moving on to the last section in our Fundamentals of Ecology course, where we start to think about ecosystems as changing things, as resilient things, and ecosystems that humans live in, and how humans transform them and manage them. So we've just finished quite a hard and theory-heavy few lectures on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this is going to be now a fun lecture to expose you to some new exciting ideas, to open your minds to possibilities of how resilience thinking and systems thinking can help us to solve some of our most challenging environmental problems. And I hope you enjoy it. So this is going to be a lecture on resilience, and then Bob's got 3 more lectures looking at transformation and human-managed ecosystems, and we're going to also talk about resource conservation. Okay, let's get down to it. I'd like you to start by watching this short YouTube clip by Brian Walker. You can just copy and paste the link into your browser if it doesn't work when you click on it. Now you can tell by his accent that Brian Walker is a South African. In fact, he was an academic at Wits for many years, and his office is the one that I am currently occupying in the biology building today. Since then, however, he moved to Australia and ran a large research organization there, and he has spent many decades of his life working on resilience and sustainability. And this is his introduction to the topic. So please take some time to listen to this lovely introduction. So Brian Walker has explained resilience, and now I'm going to define resilience for you. Resilience is the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb disturbance without shifting to an alternative state and losing function and services. And to measure resilience, we often measure 2 aligned terms, which is resistance, or the magnitude of disturbance that causes a change in structure, and recovery, the speed of return to the original structure. As Brian Walker indicated, resilience is a central concept in the management of natural ecosystems. The next thing I would like to define is a regime shift. A regime shift is a large, persistent change in the structure and function of ecological or socio-ecological systems. If we go back to the ball in cup analogy that Brian Walker introduced, a regime shift happens when the ball moves into a new cup. We call it a new basin of attraction or an alternative state. Now, Brian Walker didn't really go into too much detail about how systems are resilient. In his example of the human body temperature, he mentioned that there were feedbacks where a stimulus from the environment, for example, getting too hot, resulted in a response from the body, for example, sweating, that cooled the body down again. So in that case, when it got too hot, the body responded in a way that cooled the body down. So there was a feedback from the body out and back again. So a feedback is an interaction between components of a system where the response to a change in one component feeds back to affect that component again. And an ecosystem is kept in a particular state by a set of feedbacks. So we're going to have to understand feedbacks and define them and think about them and try to turn them into something that makes sense ecologically. You get basically 2 types of feedback. This is the first type of feedback, which is a positive feedback. A positive feedback loop, or a reinforcing loop, is a system where one variable increases the quantity of another variable, which in turn increases the quantity of the first variable. Positive feedback loops are amplifying, self-multiplying processes. So for example, here's this little thing at the bottom of the slide. If you've got a few cattle running, then other cattle start to panic, and that increases the overall level of panic and makes more cattle run, and before you know it, you've got a stampede of cattle. You could think of that as a positive feedback loop, where interactions between the components of the system amplify each other. Another example is money growth. If you put money in a bank account, you get more interest, which means you get more money. It's positive feedback. Another example that I'm sure all of you have experienced is when you get feedback from a microphone. When a sound entering the microphone is reproduced by a loudspeaker and then picked up again by the microphone and re-amplified again and again until it is painful to hear. Now you see in the second point here, I say positive feedback loops are amplifying that can be positive or negative. So what does that mean? It's a positive feedback loop, but it can be positive or negative. So positive feedback loops can either cause growth, for example, the money in your bank account where it gets more and more and more, or they can cause a runaway collapse where they get less and less and less, where less of one thing results in less of another thing, which results in less of the original thing. An example of a positive feedback loop that is negative or destructive could be erosion, causing less rooted plants, which then causes more erosion. So you get a little bit of erosion, and that makes it harder for plants to root. And you all know from your soils lecture that the fewer the rooted plants, the more the propensity to be eroded. So you get runaway feedback towards collapse of your rangeland. So how can you get a negative positive feedback loop? Basically, it works just like maths. If you go back to your high school maths, you remember a minus plus a minus makes a plus. So two negative feedbacks together make a positive or amplifying feedback. So if you have so it's just like in maths, basically. You have to look at the entire system and work out how many negatives and how many positives there are, and overall you work out whether it's a positive, whether things are getting more and more and more, or whether it's negative. Okay, I've given you at least 3 examples of positive feedback loops. So let's think about negative feedback loops. A negative feedback loop, or a stabilizing loop, occurs in biology when a product of a reaction leads to a decrease in that reaction. So the example Brian Walker gave of your body regulating its temperature is a typical example of a negative feedback loop. It's a stabilizing loop. It manages to stabilize your temperature at 37.5 because every time your body goes up, there's a response that makes your body get cooler. And if your body gets cooler, there's a response that makes your body get hotter. So it stabilizes. So negative feedback loops decrease or reverse change in a system, and they can be sources of stability as well as resistance to change. The example in the diagram here is a very simple one. If you feel tired, then you go to sleep. And if you go to sleep, you feel less tired. So that stabilizes your body. It can be confusing to call these things positive and negative because the word positive implies that it's a good thing. However, in the context of living ecosystems, it is the negative feedback loops that are often considered good because these are the feedbacks that help to stabilize systems and keep them resilient in the face of change. So it's the negative feedback loops that help to keep the ball inside the cup so that any change that happens, the negative feedback loops push the system back into its stable state. The third thing that I want to define is a tipping point. The Oxford Dictionary defines a tipping point as the point at which a series of small changes or incidents becomes significant enough to cause a larger, more important change. The term was made popular by Malcolm Gladwell in his very enjoyable book on the subject, which was called The Tipping Point. And you guys should have a read of it. It's a very easy read, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a lot of way to kind of see how systems thinking can go all the way across different disciplines. Because most of Malcolm Gladwell's examples were social or economic or political examples. So I'm going to, in the next few slides, look at some ecological examples to try to make all of these ideas a bit more relevant. Another word people use with tipping points is a threshold. A threshold or a tipping point is where the positive feedbacks overwhelm the negative feedbacks. So you can think of these systems as having some positive and some negative feedbacks. The negative ones are stabilizing and the positive feedbacks are runaway change. And at that point where the positive feedbacks overwhelm the negative ones, you've reached a threshold or a state shift. And you can go into a different type of system. Okay, I said I'd give you some ecological examples. Let's use an ecological example that you've engaged with a little bit on this course already. You've engaged a little bit with elephants and their population growth with Jason. So African woodlands are what we call a resilient ecosystem. They can have variable tree cover depending on disturbances, depending on the amount of fire and herbivory, and particularly the amount of elephants. As you can see from the picture here, elephants act to knock down trees. But the trees in this system are adapted to frequent disturbance, and they can recover quickly by resprouting. Therefore, with few elephants in the system, even if elephants knock down some trees, the system is resilient and it tends to recover quickly back to its original state. The high woody cover acts as a stabilizing feedback, keeping intense fires out of the systems and enabling regeneration of other trees. People have observed, however, that once elephant numbers reach above about 0.5 animals per kilometre squared, so half an animal per hectare, then the system hits a tipping point. At this point, there are so many elephants and they've opened so many gaps in the trees that light comes in and light-loving grasses come into the system. This creates a new set of feedbacks where the grasses burn in really intense fires, and these fires stop the trees from recruiting and growing up again to shade the grass. If you want to read up more about this, you can read papers by Cumming. The original one was in 1997, and then he applied a systems thinking approach to it in his book in 2011. So in this situation, the system can switch from a closed woodland with some disturbances, but resilient, always going back to being a closed woodland, to an open grassland or shrubland over a very short period of time. Once it hits the tipping point, it switches very quickly. And the key thing to remember is that even if elephant numbers go down again, once you're in a grassy fire system, the fire and the grass together keep the system open. So even if the elephant numbers go down below 0.5 animals per kilometre squared, it doesn't switch back to being a woodland because you've got a new set of feedbacks operating that are keeping it in that cup, in the grassland cup. So in this situation, there are two stabilizing feedbacks, one in each basin of attraction. You've got, on the left-hand side, you've got high woody cover, which means low grass biomass, which means cool fires, which results in high woody cover. On the right-hand side, you've got low woody cover, which means high grass biomass, which means hot fires, and hot fires keep the woody cover low. So they're both stable states. The woodland and the grassland state are both stable, being maintained by these stabilizing feedbacks. But they can switch. You can switch from one to the other by pushing the system with the amount of elephants. The number of elephants is the disturbance that causes the ball to move around in the cup. But only when the number of elephants reaches a tipping point does the system switch to a new state. So now I've tried to take all those concepts that I've introduced you to over the previous few slides and turn them into something that's a bit more tangible, that you can actually imagine happening in a real ecosystem. You've also done some lectures in systems thinking with Jason earlier in the block, and you did a practical where you looked at elephant population growth. So the tools that he introduced to you are the tools that people use for understanding state shifts and resilience. So yeah, if you're interested in these tools and ideas, then you'll learn about them in third year and in honours. This is just a figure that we took from a book around these stabilizing feedbacks and elephants and land cover change and state shifts. But there's many, many examples. And just to expose you to the idea that there are really interesting modeling frameworks that can be used, and you use them to quantify the transition probabilities, the chances or the probabilities that systems are going to switch between different ecosystem states. So it's very exciting stuff that if you're interested in, we can expose you to it later. Let's use another example that should also be familiar to you from your lectures with Dara. Freshwater eutrophication refers to the excessive growth of aquatic plants or algal blooms due to high levels of nutrients in freshwater ecosystems such as lakes and reservoirs and rivers. So we all know nutrients enter freshwater lakes from agricultural fertilizers, sewage, and urban stormwater. However, as the nutrients increase in small lakes, you don't immediately observe a large change in the ecosystem properties. The lakes remain clear because the excess phosphorus or nitrogen is being absorbed by the sediments and also taken up by the aquatic plants, and the fish keep the algae numbers low. However, if the nutrient concentrations, particularly phosphorus, if they continue to increase, it can cross a threshold or a tipping point, and the algal growth becomes so high that it cuts out the light and the oxygen. The aquatic plants and the fish die, and the system switches to a murky and a turbid state because you no longer have those stabilizing feedbacks where the plants and the fish keep it clear. So it's important to note again that even if you realize what has happened and you reduce the nutrient levels, the system does not switch back to a clear lake because there are new feedbacks between the algae and the low oxygen levels which keep it in its novel state. So the algae maintain it in the state where you can't have fish to eat the algae, and then you can't switch back to being a clean lake again. You can see from this example and from the previous one why it is important to identify these tipping points. It's much easier to keep a clear lake clear by reducing nutrients than it is to switch a turbid lake back into a clear state. So we need to have a warning when our ecosystems are reaching tipping points, so we can do something about it to prevent irreversible change that we don't want to happen. So I hope I've persuaded you with the last two examples how important feedbacks are and how important understanding feedbacks are in ecological systems. Remember, negative or stabilizing feedbacks are the key to maintaining systems in one state in the face of environmental variability. Because as environments change, it's stabilizing feedbacks that keep the system in a kind of recognizable state. State shifts can occur when these feedbacks break down. They can break down either because the perturbation is too strong, it's been pushed too much, or because the environment has changed to the point that the feedback can no longer operate. So for example, in the situation where the fish died, there's no longer a feedback, but the stabilizing feedback between the fish and the algae. There are many other examples of state shifts and feedbacks in ecological systems. Forest-savanna boundaries are classic ones. Overgrazing is another classic one. Remember I mentioned erosion. I'm going to mention one more state-like example of feedbacks that is associated with some of your previous lecture material. You will remember from the energy balance lecture that a typical ocean albedo is approximately 0.06, while bare sea ice varies from about 0.5 to 0.7. So snow and sea ice reflect a lot more light and energy than water. Water absorbs energy. So the ocean reflects only 6% of the incoming solar radiation and absorbs the rest, while the sea ice reflects 50 to 70% of the incoming energy. The sea ice absorbs less solar energy and keeps the surface cooler. And snow has an even higher albedo than sea ice. So thick sea ice covered with snow reflects as much as 90% of the incoming solar radiation. And this insulates the sea ice, maintaining cold temperatures and delaying ice melt in the summer. So even in the summer, there's ice caps over the Arctic because of the stabilizing feedback. After the snow does begin to melt, and because the shallow melt ponds have an albedo that's much lower, the surface albedo drops to about 0.75. And then the melt ponds grow and deepen and the surface albedo drops and drops. And as a result, the melt ponds are associated with higher energy absorption and a more rapid ice melt. So you have these two feedbacks happening in this system, where either you have snow keeping it cool and icy, or you have ocean keeping it warm. And it really matters when it shifts from one state to the other. And this is why you can see that global warming might have a big difference on which of these feedbacks is the dominant feedback in the Arctic. I haven't really asked you to do much reading so far in this course. I've given you lots of suggestions, but none of them were actually required. However, this paper is required reading, and I will add some questions in the quiz about it, and we're going to have some engagement over the next few weeks as we prepare for our exam around catastrophic shifts in ecosystems. So give it a try. I'll put it on the e-learning site. There's one final thing I want to point out relating to resilience, and that is to distinguish between resilience and resistance. A resilient community is one that returns rapidly to something like its former structure after that structure has been altered. Whereas a resistant community is one that undergoes relatively little change in its structure in the face of a disturbance. So you can see how they're quite different. A resilient community changes a lot. If you perturb it, it changes, but it has stabilizing negative feedbacks that take it back to its former structure. Whereas a resistant community doesn't change. If you push it and change it, it doesn't change. And so a resistant community is often not at all resilient. So it requires a bit of a change in your brain. It's like what Brian Walker was saying. You have to be able to understand and accept that change is good, that the ability to change in response to perturbations can sometimes be the key to maintaining stable ecosystems. Remember the example he gave of the people who were on life support, and how if you gave them the opportunity to change and respond and create these feedbacks, actually they were more likely to recover. And this is something that it's very hard for people to engage with, but there's plenty of evidence that we have to accept a certain amount of change in our ecosystems when we're trying to manage ecosystems. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in the next few lectures. All of these ideas have led to some profound shifts in how people manage and understand natural ecosystems. People have recognized that the self-repairing capacity of ecosystems should no longer be taken for granted, and they've also recognized that ecosystems can have multiple stable states, or they can be driven to multiple stable states by human activities. There's no one correct state for an ecosystem to be in. There's all different sorts of states that ecosystems can be in, and it's a bit of a value judgment which one you think is the one that you want to manage for. I want to give you an example where people have used these ideas to develop management guidelines for the Kruger National Park. What they've basically done in the Kruger National Park is to identify thresholds of potential concern for various ecosystem properties. And these TPCs, as they're called, thresholds of potential concern, are really equivalent to warning signs that we're about to reach tipping points and possibly switch into undesirable states that it would be difficult to reverse. So the scientists in the Kruger Park have done a lot of thinking about what they think the tipping point is, and then they've tried to develop some warning signs about when they think they're approaching the tipping point, and that is the TPC. There are about 10 of them that have been identified by the Kruger Park, and they relate to things like fire, frequency of fire, intensity of fire, number of elephants, amount of invasive plants, and many other things. So if you look at this graph over here, the idea is that an ecosystem can bounce around in the graph. The desirable zone is any area within that graph, and the system can bounce from being the bottom left-hand corner. It can go all the way up, it can go a little bit to the right. All of those states are desirable. But the management of Kruger Park is trying to stop it from going outside this desirable zone. So the moment the system hits a threshold of potential concern, then they institute management to try to push it back into the desirable zone and stop it tipping over into an undesirable zone. So that's a visual representation of what Kruger's trying to do. It's accepting change, it's understanding that these systems are variable and that there are feedbacks that help it, but it's trying to make sure that you never have a system where the feedbacks break down and it goes over into undesirable states. Of course, it's hard to explain all of that complex systems thinking to the general public. This is an example of how the Kruger Park has communicated their elephant threshold of potential concern to tourists, trying to explain that they monitor elephant numbers and they let them vary and they let the elephants affect ecosystems up to a certain point, at which point they try to institute management interventions that push the system back into its desirable state. So these are the things I'd like you to be able to do by the end of this lecture. You need to be able to explain the term resilience, and you need to be able to contrast resilience and resistance. You need to be able to distinguish clearly between a positive or amplifying feedback and a negative or stabilizing feedback. And actually, I should add that it would be good if you can give some examples of each of these feedbacks. They don't have to be ecological examples. You need to be able to define the term tipping point and describe the processes that can result in a state shift. And then you need to give some ecological examples of how state shifts occur and which feedbacks break down and which feedbacks help to keep things in different states. And then you need to be able to discuss what these ideas mean for how we manage natural ecosystems.